So hello everyone and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that whenever it hears ABBA decides to do the robot. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. Had a nice relaxing weekend in a field.
Oh, cool. That sounds lovely. Was the weather okay for it?
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah. No, I had a nice weekend too. Lovely wedding, and then a relaxing time, just sort of stripping wallpaper out of my bathroom. So yeah, no, big times are changing ahead. But yeah, we'll see how we go.
That sounds like a lovely weekend. We'll move right on into the headlines. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, let's go for it.
So I think before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just found a stupid headline that I'd like to read out from the Daily Star. Star wins salad cream wars.
Yeah, I think we'll all tell our children where we were when the salad cream wars were on. Desperate times. Yeah, no, I think I saw this one as well in the week and thought, isn't there more important stuff going on, Star? But no, this is this is the news that Heinz were going to change the name of salad cream to sandwich cream. However, apparently it says it's bowed to the will of the people on this and changed it back to salad cream. And I think the Daily Star were sort of the hub of the campaign to keep it as salad cream. I found a very nice website here, which I will put in the Discord, and you can add to the show notes. That shows some lovely protesters deciding to. They're outside a supermarket for some reason protesting this. I have no idea why, and I have no idea whether they think that would change it. But yes, that's the big news this week. Salad cream is safe once again.
That's good to hear. As someone who mostly prefers mayonnaise, I mean, clearly a Remainer here. I don't really care that much for salad cream, but yeah, it seems that was a bit of a silly piece of news.
Yeah.
Oh well, I mean, at least with Brexit around us, we will at least still be able to call salad cream salad cream.
I like how you said you were a Remainer there. I'd like to call you a Remayonaise. Oh. See what I did there? It's just. You might be able to subtly notice the word mayonnaise in that word somewhere, but yeah.
No, it's impressive. Didn't see it coming. So moving on to some actual news. I think first one is Boris v May. Now it's war, from the Sunday Times.
Yeah, we'll touch on this in a bit more detail later in our main stories, which will focus on the party conferences. But this is the news that once Boris Johnson has been outside the cabinet, he's now become a lot more vocal of Theresa May and the way that she's sort of running the country, and has come out with his own sort of version of what to do about Brexit, attacked some of Theresa May's sort of personal policies, some unpopular ones as well, some conservative policies that are seen as very unpopular with the general public, things like HS2, the high-speed rail link, which has upset some conservative voters in rural constituencies where the rail line's going through. And yeah, this was just one of many public jibes against Theresa May by Boris Johnson, who seems to have the ear of many of the more right-wing leaning newspapers. He used to edit and have a column in the Daily Telegraph. So those sort of papers seem to be supporting his kind of bid for leadership should May fail in hers.
And I believe, I mean, even if this is all bluster, I believe he's doing very well out of it. I saw a story the other day saying his salary from the various newspapers he writes for has doubled since he left the cabinet, because I think partly because he's able to be a bit freer in what he says, but it's also generating sales because he's saying ridiculous stuff.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, and then sticking with the Times, but not on Sunday, May agrees curbs on trade to break Brexit deadlock.
Yeah, I believe this is the story that Theresa May sort of threatened the EU with the possibility of us opening up more trade to the world in the case of a no-deal Brexit. So she says, that's fine. If we don't get a deal from the EU, we can go and get a deal elsewhere. That's very much parroting the ideas of what hard Brexiteers have said in the past. And I don't know how effective it will be as a negotiating tactic. But it's certainly one that may scare European leaders and might give them a bit more urgency to have a deal if they think the UK can just go ahead and get whatever it wants elsewhere, particularly with things like The USA's just completed its trade deal with Mexico and Canada, something that I think a lot of analysts didn't think would happen in the long term, or they didn't think Trump would be successful. But he's been managed to get that through relatively quickly. If May was able to achieve something with that speed, with sort of opportunistic countries looking for cheap trade, then the EU could possibly lose out.
I think briefly on NAFTA, didn't it get renamed to US-MCA or something? And I feel like the Americans will get more behind something with the US in the name, even though it's just an abbreviation of all of the names of the countries.
Yeah, I think a big thing behind that was Trump had sort of rubbish NAFTA so much that he was desperate to give it a new name so people just didn't associate it with the old thing that he'd said was rubbish all along. With Trump, it's all very much about branding, and rebranding that trade deal was one of his big accomplishments in government.
Okay, so moving on to the Financial Times and also the Sunday Times again. But I suppose this is following on from stories we've touched on in previous weeks. In the Financial Times, West launches attack on Russia with claims of cybercrime spree. And in the Sunday Times, UK war games cyber attack on Moscow.
Yeah, this is the UK sort of getting more public with its the details of its espionage war against Russia. We've mentioned previously that Russia has been seen to be more culpable in the Salisbury attacks. And I think this week it was broken by Dutch authorities that there had been Russians inside of a drugs organization that was trying to identify the chemical substance used in the attack. There were Russians there who had then been expelled and proven to be Russian spies. All of this has led the UK to say we are taking steps to try and curb Russian influence and even hack into Russian systems themselves. They've also sort of said that Russia has had several cyber hacking activities against the UK. These can be as serious as trying to sort of undermine security or even trying to undermine professional athletes. So some of the names on the list of people who've been targeted are people like Bradley Wiggins and Chris Froome, professional cyclists who had used legal drugs in their training, but that was leaked by Russian organizations to try and make it look like they'd been doping and cheating to kind of counteract the scandal that Russia had been thrown out of the Olympic Federation for all of their proved doping charges earlier. So it's a bit of back and forth, and there's a lot about how Russia conducts its espionage and how it tries to use this sort of like information as a weapon to try and undermine and discredit other regimes. And this is seen as a very public attack by the UK, sort of to unmask this activity by Russia and say we're prepared to do it back to you as well.
Yeah, so kind of an ongoing story, I suppose.
Yeah.
Still, like, I mean, I suppose that is the news. A thing happens, it keeps getting mentioned, but I feel like we thought this was kind of finished with, and it keeps coming up.
Yeah, I don't think it will finish anytime soon. The problem with all these things is it's so hard to definitively say 100% certain that that's what's happened. That's what espionage is, and that's kind of because it's hard to say 100% yes or no. That's what sort of the Russian tactics are of throwing that disinformation and say, well, if you can't prove it 100%, then maybe this is a big conspiracy by the government, by the West, who have always tried to do this to us, blah, blah, blah. That's simplifying it a little bit, but that's one of the ways they act, and that's one of the ways they try and get allies within the UK or within Western countries to try and support the Russian point of view, if that makes sense.
Our next headline from The Independent is, keep full access to single market, voters tell May.
This is news of a poll conducted by the Independent newspaper that voters basically want to remain in the single market and have access to it, even if Brexit goes ahead. This support, they say, has sort of grown steadily since the result of the referendum and has now passed 60%. So the inclination here is that if May was unable to secure a deal where the UK had access to the single market, that might be going against the will of the people. And if that fails, then that might lead to a second referendum on the issue. That might be something that voters care enough about. They might not want to leave the EU if they can't get access to that. This is just one poll in one newspaper, so it's hard to sort of say it definitively. As we've mentioned in the past, polls are never 100% accurate, but it's nice to see a Brexit poll that isn't 50-50. I think we've always said that the 48-52 divide makes it a very sort of split issue where nobody can decide. If voters could all agree that they wanted single market access and they also wanted curbs on immigration, for example, it might be a lot easier for Theresa May to come to the public with sort of a manifesto or an idea of a Brexit idea that the whole country was behind. At the moment, it seems that we're sort of split 50-50 on a lot of issues, which makes any proposed solution by nature controversial because there's such large people who don't agree what's going on, even on like the pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit sides. So this piece of news is really interesting. I feel it's like a very economic point, but I'm happy to see it. I think I would want to keep full access to the single market as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we both agreed that would be useful, but I think it has been worrying in the last few weeks, as it looks like things that we were kind of assuming we were trying to get are slowly slipping away. Right, so moving into the headlines that lead into our main topic for tonight, I've got 4 for you, split 2 to Labour, 2 to the Conservatives. So in The Independent, Corbyn declares war on greed is good capitalism, and get a good Brexit deal or face Labour veto, Corbyn tells May, in The Guardian.
This is the news that's come out of the Labour Party conferences. And if it's okay with you, shall we dive in with the deep news on the Labour Party conference?
Yeah, we can do that, and then we can do the Conservative one. Yep, sounds good.
So, this is the news that, it's been party conference season. How have you found party conference season? Have you been excited? Have you been staying up to watch all the speeches? What have you been doing?
I've not really had the time to watch all the speeches, but I have been following along probably more than I did last year. So yeah, I've been paying some attention.
It's trust me, like party conference season is something that used to be sort of circled in my diary when I was editing a politics magazine. There's like, oh, that'll be interesting. But it is amazing how to like the wider public, it fails to make a dent. What I was just going to bring up at the start actually is particularly for our listeners in the US to tell them what a party conference is and what uses it has in the UK. So to briefly explain it, party conferences happen yearly, usually in late September, early October, just after Parliament has come back from its summer holidays. The best equivalent I've been able to match it to in the US would be the party conventions. So that's where they sort of nominate a president and it happens 4 years, and that's a chance for the whole party to get together. It happens in the UK like that, but on a far less grand scale. Instead of going to massive conference halls in the US, going to quaint seaside towns like Blackpool or Brighton, typically because, traditionally it was because the accommodation used to be cheaper in those seaside towns after the summer holidays had finished. That was literally why they went there. But nowadays, people like Labour might go to a bigger city like Birmingham or Liverpool, somewhere that they think will support the working class ideals and try and get a big turnout there. The whole point of them is kind of give the parties a focus for the rest of the year, so they can write a mini manifesto and they can write out everything that they'd like to either challenge the government on or achieve as a government. It also acts as a place for parties to get enhanced media coverage during these events, and there's kind of a de facto deal that that Labour will never hold their conference at the same time as the Conservative Party to make sure that each party has its chance to shine on the stage, and they then don't have to keep reacting to what the other one says every day. They can have a very focused message. The other sort of side thing that the conferences can do, this is more of a point for Labour than it is Conservatives, but the Conservatives can still have it to a little extent, is the chance for the members themselves to shape what policy the party follows. There are usually motions that are put to the conference floor, and by a show of hands, like yay or nay, the conference will decide to carry that motion or not. It's meant to make things more democratic, but it's just worth noting in practice, there's a limit to how democratic it is. For example, to get access to the conference floor and to vote on those, you usually need to be a fully paid up member. You need to be enthusiastic enough about the party to have travelled that way and paid your accommodation. So there's a high level of political engagement that's needed there and a high barrier to entry, like if you compare it to the average voter at a ballot box. So in short, this can lead to decisions being taken that maybe the party elite might agree with, but it might not necessarily reflect the views of the general public. That's just a brief, that's a big monologue, but it's a brief idea of what encompasses, what happens at a party conference.
Okay, so that's what a party conference is. We've had the Conservative and the Labour ones, and so we're going to start on the Labour one because that came first, I think. What happened at the Labour one, really? There were some main stories, I suppose. Obviously, Brexit's going to get mentioned, and we also touched on, I think, the fact that it was news just in our last episode, I believe, about them voting on how they deselect Labour MPs, essentially, and then I suppose your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So we touched on. I'm going to start with removing sitting Labour MPs, and now that's easier now. And I touched on it a bit last week, but I've done a bit more reading to decide what's sort of going on behind that. So, in short, a vote was passed that meant that local party members only needed a vote of 33% instead of 50% to trigger a vote to deselect an MP that they thought wasn't reflecting the needs of the local party. What I didn't fully understand at the time is, although this deal seems quite radical and seems to favour what the grassroots pressure group Momentum favours, so Momentum are the guys who ran the campaign that got Corbyn into power, and they've been quite vocal about being able to deselect MPs and make it easier. This vote that they had was actually a compromise between Momentum and the trade unions, and it shows what battle there is in the Labour Party between these two forces. Momentum obviously thinks that they hold a lot of power because they have the ear of Jeremy Corbyn. They're seen as like sort of the new kids on the block. They're very democratic. They really want to value the views of the party members. The trade unions, on the other hand, are the organisation that sort of helped to create the Labour Party in the early 1900s. They were the ones that funded the MPs in the old days, and the majority of Labour's fundraising comes from trade unionship members, because the whole point of Labour, or at least it was at the start, was to represent the voice of the workers. However, trade unions are sort of seen by members of Momentum in general to be sort of the old guard, and they might be a barrier to change. And the trade unions get a vote on a Labour Party leader that's almost equivalent to that of a grassroots member, and Momentum think a grassroots member should value more than a trade union. So there's this fight in there as well that's all very interesting for the soul of the Labour Party. Moving it back to removing sitting Labour MPs, what Momentum actually wanted was that every single MP would be required to face a mandatory reselection before a general election. I can see myself why people might not want that to happen, because there's the chance for a lot of scandal to happen or for a lot of bad press to come out of those if everybody has to be voted in. It also might lead to a great deal of chaos just before a general election and a deal of uncertainty about the direction of the party. You may think you're going into a general election with somebody as a shadow chancellor or somebody as a shadow foreign secretary, only to have that changed 6 months before the election might be quite disruptive. So I can see why the Labour Party decided to go for a less radical or a more traditional change. Another one of the big changes they did was about how to appoint Jeremy Corbyn's successor. So one of the controversial things at the time when Corbyn got nominated was that he needed the support of 10% of Labour MPs. Now, Corbyn wouldn't have been able to get that support if he didn't have some people who just nominated their support for the hell of it, or because they thought there should be a wide debate in the party. There was a real fear when Jeremy Corbyn had to go through his second leadership election after the 2015 Brexit referendum, when there was that challenge from within Labour, that if he had to be reselected, he wouldn't be able to get the support of enough MPs to even run on that ballot. So now it's been changed that the next leader of the Labour Party will need 10% of MP supports, but will also need 5% of local members or 5% of local union members to back them. So if there's a grassroots candidate, then they might be able to get through, or it might stop a very an MP who's very popular within Westminster but very unpopular amongst the members having a chance to lead the Labour Party. And this sort of shows that there's a brewing battle in Labour between grassroots members who are looking to democratise the party and trade union members who fund that. And whoever wins, you kind of don't, I think if you're a Labour Party supporter, you don't want one group to win entirely. The Labour Party needs both of those factions in order to function.
I was just going to say, it is interesting, as you say, because the trade unions were very much part of what set Labour up, that now there's this movement inside to maybe move away from that, and grassroots is becoming very important. I have got something to say about the Lib Dems later that kind of relates to that. So shall we carry on into continuing with Labour so we don't get distracted? What happened with regards to Brexit at the Labour Party conference?
Yeah, we mentioned this briefly in our last episode, that the party backed a motion that stated, and I quote, "If we cannot get a general election, Labour must support all options remaining on the table, including campaigning for a public vote. If the government is confident in negotiating a deal that working people, our economy and communities will benefit from, they should not be able to be afraid to put that deal to the public." So I will briefly translate that statement for you. It essentially says that if the Conservatives don't get a deal that we, the Labour Party, also support, then we hold the right to either have a general election or force the government to have a public referendum on that bill. The phrase "all options remaining on the table" is really important because it means that Labour's Brexit position says that, we still support Brexit if it's what the people want and if it's a good Brexit, but if it's a bad Brexit, then maybe we'll rethink this. So it's trying to both get the support of Remainers, who there are quite a lot of Remainers who support Jeremy Corbyn, and there's also, she's trying to reach out to those who support Brexit as well, maybe in some of the more working class Labour areas that tended to vote more Leave during the referendum. They still make up quite a large part of Labour's vote percentage up there. So it's a fine line that Labour has to walk to keep both those parties happy, and this agreement sort of does. It sort of keeps it together, but at the same time, it also leaves them open from attack from pro-Brexit Conservative MPs who've sort of said that, this is, the typical Brexit lines of attack of this won't respect the will of the people if you just run the referendum again, and all that. But I do think it has done, what it was meant to do, and calm fears amongst Remainers, which, as I've stated, tend to be more pro-Corbyn, tend to be younger, tend to be where Labour are picking up the largest sort of growth in their voters amongst that percentage of voters. So keeping them happy is vitally important. And the fact that it was voted on in the conference floor, it was seen as a very public vote. It was a challenge to Corbyn almost, who they said, well, you're in favour of democratising the Labour Party. This is something which Labour members really want. They really want they really want the UK not to leave the European Union. Why not listen to your members and give them a chance to stop this if it looks really, really bad?
Pardon me. Yes. No, I think what you're saying there about having the vote is, it's interesting that it's described as like a challenge to Corbyn, but it's also, that's kind of the view he's trying to have, right? Surely it looks good for him to say, well, look, I'm accepting that.
Oh yeah, totally. That's really good for him. I'd say the only thing is that Labour's Brexit position has always been a little unsure, and it's sort of fluid with whoever you talk to. I remember talking to somebody who was campaigning for Labour in the 2017 election, who said he could literally knock on door to door and say, like, how did you vote for Brexit? Oh, well, the Labour Party obviously supports Brexit, respects the will of the people, and then could go to a Remainer and say, oh yes, well, we don't want a bad Brexit deal, we'll get one for you, and if the time is, and if the deal is bad, then of course we'll have a second referendum. They can kind of say both things to both sets of voters, which is fine for now when they're not in power and they don't have the ability to influence those events, but may have to change if they were to win a general election.
Yeah. And also, they'd be suddenly stuck with enacting it because it's kind of in process if they or dealing with the fallout depending on when such a general election occurs. So those are two specific things. How did you feel about the Labour conference in general?
Yeah, I think this is the one where Labour looked most like a government in waiting. So I've taken notice of a few of them before now. I'd say before the 2017 election, people didn't really take Labour seriously, and that was reflected in the polls as well at the time. I've mentioned on several occasions that Labour was at once 20 percentage points behind the polls from the Conservatives, and many people just thought it was, Jeremy Corbyn's doing his thing, he's doing his loony left thing. That's what the right-wing papers would say, and they wouldn't really pay attention to it as anything that could seriously happen. Now, with the polls being so close, with the very successful performance of Labour in the 2017 election, with a manifesto that was quite left-wing, now commentators and those within the Conservative Party are now taking it more seriously, and you're listening to the Labour Party conference thinking, oh wow, this could actually be a policy that's put into action. That's quite exciting. So you've got things like Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell talking about nationalisation of the railways, of energy companies, Royal Mail, stuff like that, and you've really got to consider the implications of that. There was also quite an exciting proposal about giving more powers to the workers. So big companies would be forced to have at least 1% of their shares given to employees, and for them to make sure that they have a voice in sort of big boardroom decisions, to make sure that we don't give too much power to kind of faceless corporations, which sometimes feels like that. And I don't know, did you see any of the Corbyn speech at all?
I haven't watched the whole thing, but I saw some selected clips.
I thought it was a really sort of powerful speech, one of his best. I think he's grown into the role of leader that he's had. And it's the first time, or it's one of the first times, that he's been able to stand on the podium and think, I have the support of the MPs in this room as well as the grassroots members. I think the results of the 2017 election put his policies, made it look like they could be successful, and that a radical plan could be achieved. We mentioned in the headlines earlier that Corbyn declared a war on greed is good capitalism, and that was summed up in his speech, where he sort of said that 10 years ago we'd had a financial crash, and that proved, and that was after 10 years of Labour government. It showed, or at least Corbyn thinks it proved, that the old ways of running society and the economy weren't working, and that a more radical approach is needed. And in Jeremy Corbyn's view and the Labour Party's view, the solution to that would be voting in this Labour government. So, yeah, I think it's very exciting times for Labour. I think it's the first time that they've seemed like a government in waiting. And at the next party conference, if there is one before the general election, this is where you really have to keep focused on what Labour are saying and thinking that all their policies could become a reality. Yeah,
so I suppose that's quite a glowing recommendation, really, from you. I like if you say they're saying looking like a government in waiting, and I think I can say, like, we've seen Corbyn doing a lot of stage-related events and stuff, and I think we discussed previously he's got a new PR manager, or his PR team is actually starting to explain to him, like, he does, as you say, look a bit more, not more ministerial, because he's always been an MP, but you know what I mean. He, as you say, looks more like he could challenge the current government.
a bit of a flippant point, this one. I listened to another podcast, The New Statesman, and they've been talking about how different people within Corbyn's sort of core group have changed over time. They say that John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, is the one that's becoming more of a politician. He's got most of the ideas, the sort of the ones for running the country. They maybe, you could argue this is a bit dismissive, but they talk about Jeremy Corbyn as the magic grandpa, which basically suggests that he's the public figure. He's the smiley face. He's the friendly face of the Labour Party that draws the young people in and gets the chance of, oh, Jeremy Corbyn. You know, he's the enthusiasm of the party. But if you want to look at the politics of it, the core policies, then look at people like John McDonnell, look at people like Diane Abbott, the people who will be running the policy side of things. If Labour was to come into government, they're the ones you really need to focus on in the next couple of years to get an idea of what will be enacted by the Labour Party if they do get into power.
So back to the headlines for the Conservative Party conference. In the Observer, May bids for centre ground with appeal to Labour voters. And then, well, I suppose these are two headlines here, Daily Express and the Metro. So we have Let's All Dance to May's Tune in the Daily Express. And in the Metro, they had Pole Dancer. I suppose maybe we should start with that, the most memorable image from the Conservative Party conference.
Yeah. If you've paid any attention to the Conservative Party conference, you will have seen this bizarre clip of Theresa May dancing in her very, let's say, unique style, to be kind. You certainly couldn't mistake it for dancing, but it's sort of like this robot dance onto stage, onto ABBA's Dancing Queen. This was sort of her commenting on her dancing poorly in her recent trip to Africa, and this had been made fun of. It was an odd move by her, but a lot of people, and I think her own personal team said after the event that they had no idea that she was going to do it. But maybe it seems to have. I think maybe it's been received well. I'm not sure. Like the positive side of it is that she's sort of shaken off like the Maybot tag she's earned and shown that she's willing to make fun of herself. But I've also seen like left-wing commentators sort of on Twitter saying that, you know, it's wrong for somebody in power to do this, and maybe someone who'd overseen so many years of austerity. I saw one clip like, you know, oh, when so many people are relying on food banks, it's really not appropriate for you to be dancing the robot to, you know, Dancing Queen by ABBA. I don't know what you think of the whole thing.
I mean, it has been perfect meme material. I think a favourite one I've seen is, I'll see if I can find a link. It was on Facebook, so I'm hoping there's a YouTube version of it that we can put in the show notes. But there was that clip, but where someone has photoshopped in strings to both of her hands, and then it keeps cutting back and forth to him above as like the puppet master making a dance. It's very amusing. And yes, yeah, perfect meme material, which I suppose is one way of staying in the news. Maybe that's why she did it.
Yeah, certainly. But I mean, the weird thing is that you'll remember that, but it was hard for me to find much information about what she said in the speech because the headlines were so dominated by that, which is, I don't know what that says about our news cycle and how we learn things. But yeah, I will try and go into the actual like content of the speech as well. I think it is also worth noting that she, as well as dancing to make fun of herself, she also mentioned her previous disastrous Tory conference speech last year. Do you remember when she had the coughing fit and the P45 given to her by the comedian? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and I remembered it was bad, but I couldn't have told you off the top of my head why. And yes, now you've brought it all back.
It was pure thick of it stuff. There was everything that went wrong. The letters falling off one by one from the stand behind her. Just the whole thing seemed like a perfect metaphor of where Theresa May was after that shock 2017 election result, sort of all focused into one horrible hour of a disastrous speech. So there wasn't much of a bar for May to surpass this time round, but I think she certainly managed it. The general consensus was that it was quite an assured speech from May. Some of the big things that came out of, sort of policy-wise from her speech was that she declared an end to austerity, or at least the end of, the government having to have spending cuts, and seemed to suggest that there would be more money for the NHS, more money for public services. However, one big question mark over all of that is, well, where's the money going to come from then? Labour's sort of funds its plan by saying it'll tax big business. That's certainly not the Conservatives' policy, and certainly if we enter into a no-deal Brexit scenario, we've had warnings from Theresa May's own Chancellor that it would be disastrous for the UK economy if we were to enter into, if we had a no-deal from Brexit. So, although it sounds nice, I'm not quite sure how realistic those proposals will be. The speech also took very little notice of Brexit itself. I think it seemed to assume that the Brexit deal would be good and would just be done. May attacked people within her own party, and even though she didn't attack Boris by name, she sort of mentioned that things, there were key principles to her deal, like securing a free trade deal, and that she wasn't going to take another option that refused any of those ideals. Maybe one interesting point was that she didn't mention the Chequers deal by name, which may suggest that she's willing to dump that name, or might be willing to shift on some elements of that when negotiating with the EU. But certainly her main sort of her focus, her core ideals of what she wants from a Brexit deal will still be in place when she's the leader. Yes. Did we mention the headline of Theresa May looking to the centre, challenging the centre ground earlier? Was that right?
It was May bids for centre ground with appeal to Labour voters.
So one of the other big interesting things in her speech was how much she mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and how the lines of attack against Jeremy Corbyn have changed. I think we saw a lot when Labour were down in the polls. Nobody really took their policies seriously, and so therefore the attacks weren't on the policies, they tended to be on Jeremy Corbyn himself. And, there was quite a tremendous personal attacks in the media before the 2017 election. You saw loads of them, and they sort of still continue to this day on questioning Corbyn's character and, saying that he's appeared on Iranian state TV, all of this stuff. But those attacks just don't seem to be working, or they're certainly not dissuading the British electorate. And that does tend to be the case that, although the politics of personality do come into it a little bit, when you just focus on your opponent's flaws, you forget to mention your own policies or attack those policies, and the voters don't really. The voters just think you're smearing somebody, and they kind of dismiss your attacks as meaningless. So what May's tried to do here is said to the Conservative Party conference, look, Labour are 2 points behind us in the polls. They're a serious threat. We need to take them seriously. Therefore, I will do policies that move us more into the centre ground to try and take voters that may feel that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party has moved too far to the left and left them behind. It's probably the most sensible strategy for the Conservatives at this time. I don't think moving to the right might leave a huge vacuum in the middle for the sort of centrist voters who, although maybe their natural home would be the Lib Dems or something like that, with the Lib Dems unable to, I don't think the Lib Dems will be able to form a government or be able to win enough seats to form a government by themselves next election. Then tactical voting, which one do you choose? Do you go for Jeremy Corbyn or the Conservatives? A central voter might edge towards the Conservatives more if May moves to that centre ground. The only way that could backfire, I think, is if Corbyn's instincts are true. The Labour Party had quite a left-wing manifesto last time, and that got real enthusiasm from voters, and their actual share of the vote went up by loads. I can't remember the actual number off the top of my head, but it was a significant increase on what they'd been able to achieve under more central governments like Miliband before them. So I think we'll have to wait and see if that's a successful tactic, but I certainly think it's the most sensible and most natural place for Theresa May to go and for her to take the Conservative Party towards the centre ground. A Boris or a Jacob Rees-Mogg, their instincts might be to go further right-wing and try and completely envelop the UKIP vote. But that remains to be seen, which tactic's the most effective.
There's something I want to throw in here because the Lib Dem Party conference happened in early September, so he didn't really have a chance to cover it. So the Lib Dems are currently having a consultation. Vince Cable wants to reform the party. We already know he's stepping down, which I think we mentioned last episode. So this is quite interesting because this document, it's 14 pages and I've skimmed it because I only saw it just before we started. They start out by pointing out that there's, like you say, there's a vacuum in the middle ground. There's the Lib Dems, and it's interesting. They're talking about how it looks like we're at this point where maybe one of the big parties is going to split, and a new central party is going to form. And essentially, they're trying to get out ahead of that because they are between the two, so they're trying to grab that central vote to make the Lib Dems bigger. And so this consultation is aimed at Lib Dem members, and they're talking about opening up the party and changing some of their rules and trying to get more varied talent in, which I think is something you mentioned last time as a thing that they kind of really need to do.
Yeah, I think they were discussing the fact that they may allow a non-MP to be their leader for the first time in order to sort of broaden the demographic that they're appealing to. It's interesting. The history of, unfortunately, the history of new parties is a storied one, and one that's not always had a lot of success, unfortunately, in the past. I think we touched on it in one of our silly season specials. If you haven't listened to those, please go ahead and listen to them now. The one when we were talking about Margaret Thatcher, and that was in 1987 when the Conservatives moved to the right, Labour had moved quite far to the left, and a new party, the SDP, the Social Democrats, set up in the middle. And although they were able to get a fairly large proportion of the vote, they were unable to secure enough seats, and they sort of fell by the wayside. But I think it's certainly something that the Lib Dems need to do to stay relevant and capitalise on their unique selling points of being the central party in Britain at the moment and being the only party that fully supports remaining within the European Union. They need to sort of double down on that and increase their membership while they still can, I think. What are your thoughts on it? I know you've only had a skim read.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's interesting. I think they are. It shows that they are aware of the political climate, which is always good. They're aware that, and I think we have discussed this before. What happens if we have a disastrous Brexit and we have the Conservative Party mainline moving more right wing under Rees-Mogg? Well, we know there's a lot more there's a lot of the party further left than him. What will happen then? Will those people split off? And we've also talked about in the past how the Conservatives, they've gone through other crises in the past and they've stuck together. But this seems, partly because it's happening right now, we can't look back on it with the benefit of hindsight. But this does seem like it could be something that breaks the Conservative Party. And we've also seen that might happen in Labour. Like, I feel like Labour probably seems the most cohesive it has in a long time. Like you said, more like a government in waiting. But they definitely had a period of maybe 2 years with Corbyn where before the 2017 election, it looked like they might split down the middle. You might get a kind of a left-wing Labour Party and a more central Labour Party, kind of the Tony Blair model. And it seems that they've managed to ride that out for the time being. I don't know what would happen. I mean, if Corbyn were to lose the next general election post-Brexit, then I imagine he would be quickly ousted and we might return to the kind of existing Labour Party we were used to before he came in. But I don't know what would happen in that situation. Maybe you'd get a split. It'd be interesting. We might suddenly have 5 parties. And then, that would be an interesting general election. Yeah,
I think with the Corbyn thing, I think if he was rejected, it would be quite a shock now. But I think the result of 2017 was quite a shock. So you can never say which way it's gonna go. I think maybe what the Lib Dems are doing with this, or the equivalent I can kind of relate to, a real world example where this has happened before is Macron's party in France. So Emmanuel Macron set up a political party that was entirely new and was sort of run on the basis of you're fed up of the old traditional left versus right politics. Let's get some new people into politics and let's do some new things. And after his victory as president, they had the elections for sort of the French General Assembly, and he had a load of new people. He had a load of candidates that were from outside of politics or weren't traditional sort of career politicians, but worked in business or in charities or, you know, other sort of important social roles, but weren't politicians in themselves, and was able to get quite a big support and was able to get the party behind him after he'd won the presidency. So I think this idea that the Lib Dems have is quite interesting and could work if there's a massive disillusionment with traditional party politics, which they sort of allude to themselves on page 4 of the document you sent me. But I think that party would have a far greater chance of success compared to a party of Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem MPs who already exist within Parliament trying to get together, because I think those MPs would still be tarred with you were there when all the bad things happened. You're still career politicians. We want an entirely new approach to politics. That would be sort of the attack line that other people could have against them.
And I think it is interesting that we've talked about things going towards two-party politics, but I wonder if there's a breaking point for that in the UK. I know it's different in the States where it seems like there aren't any small parties at all almost. But here we have had the Lib Dems for a long time, and we have the Greens, and we have other small parties. And we know that I know the voting system's different, as we've mentioned previously in Germany, but they have had coalitions of like smaller parties with like maybe 60 to 80% a big party and then some small parties. And I wonder if we are coming up against a point where the larger parties can't maintain a wide enough appeal and start to split off into smaller parties. And maybe, I mean, I don't know, the polls look very split, but that's because there's only essentially 5 choices. I wonder if there were more parties available. Like, I think the only way it would work is if those existing MPs took, like say the left side of the Conservative Party, they went, okay, we're going to be a more central party by themselves. Then they would obviously bring people who voted for them before with them. I think that's the only way it could happen. I don't see a way where like starting off some new parties are going to gain a massive amount of support in the short term. I mean, maybe in the long. I mean, obviously, if you have a party and you get your message out over time, you might build support. But I think, the Lib Dems have always had a certain share of the vote. And I think that's because when they split off, they took that share of the vote with them and kind of held that position. And so I think, but I do wonder if we are coming up on a time where some of these older parties are going to break apart a bit, have some splits, and then we will end up with a wider range of parties. And that could be very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's coming to a head. I think if we have a few more general elections where there's no clear winner or none of the two parties can get a clear majority over the other, and they have to rely on third or fourth parties to get a majority, then people will start to lose faith in those two big parties of, delivering definitive government. The old adages we've said about first past the post, about the benefits of two-party politics, that at least you get things done, at least there's a decisive victor. If that's proven wrong again and again and again, then the need for a good third party, or the need for there to be a lot of choice and a sort of a coalition of thoughts on stuff will, be more acceptable in the public mind, in the public consciousness, and hopefully we can break the two-party system. I'd certainly like to see it, because rarely are choices binary. There are often many shades of grey, in my opinion, when it comes to things, and you need a lot of voices to make that decision. So, fingers crossed.
Okay, so we're going to move on into our quick polls update now. And I don't think we have the full data here, essentially, because I think the latest poll was the 29th of September, which means we don't have all of the Conservative Party conference included in that. But we can start to see, I mean, we can still discuss the polls that we have. So Do you want to take that away?
Yeah, I think much like when I mentioned the US party conventions, when they have those in the States, you usually see a little bounce for the party that's just been in the news. And they've just had the chance to have all their policies out on the big stage, and people have more of opinion, or at least they know what they stand for. This looks like, the case for Labour, who the latest poll we've got in here from BMG has Labour on +5 over the Conservatives. I would say it's probably likely since then that the Conservatives have seen a small bounce from their party conference as well. But it appears to be business as usual on the trend line, with the Conservatives slightly edging out Labour at the moment on average. I think the reaction to May's speech will be very interesting when we get to see the long ones. It will go one of two ways. Sorry, I've just realised how stupid that sounds. It could go one of two ways. It could be good or it could be bad for her. Of course it could.
Yeah. It's a game of two halves.
Yeah. So either she'll have united the Conservative Party and everybody think that her speech is wonderful and she's really got everything under control, or her appeal to the centre ground will further disillusion those on the far right of the party that Theresa May is not listening to them, and they'll just jump ship to UKIP instead. So I think, as we mentioned last time before, focusing on the Conservatives and Labour lines is important, but I also think of almost equal importance is look at the yellow lines and the green lines. Look at the Lib Dems and UKIP. That's where, if the Lib Dems are going up, then I assume that they're taking votes away from Labour. And if UKIP's going up, then they're taking votes away from the Conservatives. If either one of those lines falls down, I think you can expect to see a big rise for the opposing party.
I think interesting here, if you look back to about the 4th of September, UKIP was on about 6% and Lib Dems are only ahead on about 8%. And then from there, the Lib Dems have gone up they got up to 10%. So they went up by 2% by middle of last week. And UKIP had dropped to about 4%. And that seems to track, which is interesting because I feel like I don't associate UKIP and Lib Dem voters very much. Again, there's multiple moving lines here, so it can't. I don't think it's as clear as it looks. But now it looks like UKIP started to go back up again, and the Lib Dems have started to come down. It's almost like they're following in lockstep, and I don't know what's going on there. That's quite interesting because I wouldn't expect people to be turning away from UKIP to the Lib Dems because the Lib Dems are the ones saying, "Oh, we should stay in the EU." But it looks like they're linked. It's very interesting. I just, down there in the bottom of the poll, slightly more interesting than the normal politics at the top. But I don't really know what it means, I'm afraid. I suppose I wanted to mention a quick thing. We'll probably be discussing it in our next episode, I assume. I don't know if that's the main topic you have planned. But the midterm elections are coming up in the States. And so, well, A, we love elections, and B, it's going to be interesting because this is halfway through Trump's first term as president. Well, I mean, it's interesting. We might want to throw in a 538 link here. I think we have before where it looks closer than people might expect. If you look on 538, there's currently a forecast for the House, a 3 in 4 chance that it will go to Democrat control, which I think is what most people would expect. Trump's currently got more disapproval than approval. So I suppose it's then what will happen in the Senate. Yeah, so we've just had the Senate. We've just had Kavanaugh, which we haven't really touched on at all because it hasn't been directly in our news, but he's been approved by the Senate. So I think it's an interesting time to be a voter in the US, and it will be an interesting time for us watching that election. So yeah, I think we'll probably be covering that next time, won't we? Because it's 2 weeks away or less than 2 weeks away.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's worth covering the run up to it or the possible implications, and I think even more interestingly will be the result. It depends how both sides tend to run their campaigns. Is it a referendum on Trump and his leadership, or is it a referendum on their policies? Trump has an amazing ability to turn things into very cultural issues, hot point issues, taking the NFL as an example, like, okay, he made that turn from protest, from a protest about something very, I think the best way to phrase this, it was essentially about black rights, but Trump managed to turn that into a protest about, like, how much do you love your country and how much do you respect your flag? And issues like that, the flag issue, tend to polarize voters or tend to engage voters more than, smaller policy points. I think we'll see a lot of spin over the next few weeks, and with it, it's unlikely that Democrats will win both the House and the Senate. So Trump will probably have at least one thing to come away with, looking happy about or claiming a small victory. But I think if the Democrats can win one House and have one way of limiting Trump's power, they'll see that as a short-term victory, or a way as a positive sign moving into 2020, where they may have a chance to fight for the presidency again.
Yeah, and I mean, it's going to be interesting to discuss whatever happens, I think. So we will be here watching that. One thing I want to mention, if you are a US listener and you aren't registered to vote, you should register to vote, because, we're pro-voting here, as you may have heard. There is a brilliant brilliant video project by Hank Green, who has taken time out of his latest book tour, because he's just written a book, which I've been reading. He's taken time out of his book tour to ensure he's to set up a YouTube channel which tells you how to vote in every one of the 50 states in the US, how to sign up and register to vote, and how to vote in that state, because it's different from state to state. And yeah, I'll put that link in there. It's a really useful resource if you're based in the US and haven't registered to vote, or don't know how to register to vote in your local area. So I will throw that link in there, and yeah, spread the news and have your say, I think, is our general view on that.
Yeah, I think that I saw a graph recently that showed that turnout, particularly among sort of the youngest age demographic from 18 to 24, is usually by far one of the lowest in the midterms. So if you can get young people out to vote, get anybody out to vote, there's a real chance that you can, help swing the vote in an election. I mean, don't be put off and think, oh, my vote won't make a difference. Even if you live in the bluest or reddest part of the country, it's the way of getting your voice heard. So yeah, definitely get out and vote.
Okay, so I suppose we should wrap up there. So as always, thanks for joining me, Rob, and helping me form opinions about the political climate in the UK. And as we say every week, you can find us. You can come and join us on Discord, and you can listen along to us recording. You can join us on Facebook at Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram now at Unparl Podcast. I've actually been quite impressed with how quickly our Instagram has been gathering followers. Turns out people like short, snippety videos about Brexit. So I'll keep putting those up there if people keep liking them. Is that all the thing? Oh, yes, you can also find us on Patreon at patreon.com/TTSS, where we're trying to get enough money to buy a new microphone for Rob, so that we don't have to keep moaning about his sound quality. I'm not moaning, really. I just, I feel like we mention it every week now. It's kind of become a thing. When you finally get that microphone, we might have to have a little party or something. I
think we shall, or something. I mean, at the moment, I've got internet to get, but once I get internet and then I can get the microphone, it'll be good.
Yeah, so two of our friends are proposing that we have an evening of revelry as we leave, because at least we'll be drunk if the apocalypse happens, having left the EU. But I think the proposal was that a slightly hungover live recording of Unparliamentary Language in front of our friends might be a lot of fun. How do you feel about that?
Yes, if I can attend, I'd be very much up for that, with a live studio audience and, a question time format or whatever it is. I'd be really, really up for that.
Okay, so that sounds like a lot of fun. So that's a special that will happen sometime during the season. And I suppose all I have left to say is it's good night from me.
So good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Our next headline from The Independent: Corbyn declared... Oh, no, it isn't. Whoops. Our next headline from The Independent is